Okay, it's time to talk about Corona Sun and Sky. The way Corona Sun and Sky works is that it is trying to resemble the way Sun and Sky appear in real life. So basically, based on the position of the Sun in the sky will try to adjust and mimic how the sky would look like in that specific time of day. So for example, at sunset, when Sun is very close to the horizon, the sky would be very orangish and the sun intensity and brightness would be less, compared to noon where the sun is at its highest point and the sky would be very blue and the sun would be very intense. This real world behavior can be simply replicated using Corona Sun and Sky, so let's get into it and see how it works. As always, let me walk you through what we have in the scene. We have this tree, this bench, and we also have these two cloner which scatter 25,000 patches of grass and flower in the camera view. Unfortunately, there is a specific bug in Corona that won't allow us to interactively adjust the sun and sky and be able to see those nice grass fields and flowers. For whatever reason, the grasses disappear when adjusting the sun and you have to start a render from scratch. So that's why I'm gonna hide these two cloners while working with Corona Sun and Sky and unhide them for the final render. Okay, let's start by adding our Corona Sun and Sky. From the Corona menu, add a Corona Sun, and if I get out of the camera and go to the perspective view, you notice this Corona Sun icon has been added to the viewport. Let me just solo it out so you can see it better. If you select the Corona Sun, using the rotation and the angle parameters in the Corona Sun, you can control the direction and the height or elevation of the sun in the sky. Let's get back to our camera and run the interactive rendering. You notice the sun is there, but there is no sky. So let's add a Corona Sky from the menu as well. And now the sun and the sky are linked together, and as we change the sun's position in the sky texture will adjust accordingly. For now, let's change the rotation of the sun to around 320 degrees so we can actually see the sun disk from the camera view. Now if I try to reduce the angle from 45 degrees, you can clearly see how as I'm getting closer to the horizon or 0 degrees, the sun gets darker and the sky gets warmer and more orange. And as I increase its height or elevation or angle, we get a hotter sun and a bluer sky. And as I move in between, you can see how dramatically the placement of the sun changes the lighting in the scene and the sky texture. For now, let's set the angle to around 15 degrees. We can edit the Corona Sky by simply selecting the Corona Sky tag that has been applied to the sky. You can control how exactly it looks and control parameters like turbidity, but the overall look of the sky will be determined by how we position the sun in our scene and how close or far is the sun from the horizon line. If your render is overexposed, we can decrease the exposure, in this case probably by 4 stops, and set it to -4. Also, I'm going to increase the highlight compression to around 2 so we can see the sun disk. Increasing the highlight compression basically reduces the effect of burning in the brightest part of the render. Now, if I select the Corona Sun, you notice we have a very self-explanatory options. Intensity controls the overall intensity and brightness of the sun. So if I go from 1 to 5, we immediately get a more intense sun, which is much brighter. And if I set it to something like 0.2, it will be less intense and the lighting is basically dominated by the sky. Let's put it back to 1. Then we have the size of the sun, which controls two things: the size of the visible sun disk and the sharpness of the shadows produced by the sun. When the size is set to 1, we get this kind of clear, sharp shadows from the sun. But if we increase the size to a higher value like 10, we get a bigger visible sun disk and much diffuser shadows. You can get crazy with this value, and if we set it to something like 30, you can see how big the disk gets and how diffuser the shadows are. Let's set it back to 1. Down here you can control the color of the sun. By default it's set to use color from sky, which is very realistic, and you should be using this option normally, but you can use any other colors that you want. So if I enable this color option, I can change the color of my sunlight to any weird color that I want. Or we can use any Kelvin color temperature. Let's set it back to use color from sky again. Down here we also have a bunch of simple visibility options. Visible directly, which enables or disables the visibility of the sun disk in the sky, and visible in reflection and refraction determines whether the sun disk will be visible in the reflections and refractions. And now let's take a quick look at the Corona Sky options. So let's select the Corona Sky tag. You can obviously add this sky tag by simply right-clicking on your Sky Cinema 4D Sky geometry and adding a Corona Sky tag, but you can obviously do that automatically using the Corona menu up here. First we have the sky models, which are basically different procedural sky textures. We have two options here, and I hope not to butcher the names: Hosek and Wilkie and Rawa Fake. The Hosek and Wilkie model is the most physically accurate and realistic one, and we have Rawa Fake model, which is totally fake, and this model allows for some imaginary sky colors. Down here in its parameters you can obviously manually control the zenith and the horizon color. You can select any color that you want, then probably match the color of your Corona sun with them and get a nice sky. For now, let's change the model to Hosek and Wilkie, and here we have a bunch of self-explanatory parameters as well. Turbidity controls the overall amount of particles, aerosols, and pollutants in the sky. The lower the value, the cleaner the sky, and the higher the value, the hazier it gets. Set it back to about 2.5. Intensity controls the overall brightness of the sky. If I set it to something like 0.1, it gets much darker, and if set it to something like 2 or 3, it gets very, very bright. 1 is the physically accurate value here. The next option is horizon blur, which controls how sharp or blurred the horizon line is. To see this parameter a bit better, let's hide the ground object and get out of our camera and reveal a bit more of the sky. If the horizon blur is set to 0, you can see the line gets to be very, very sharp, and if something like 0.1 or 0.2 or higher values up to 1 are used, the horizon line gets blurrier. We have ground color, which determines the color of the ground in the Corona sky, and as I change the ground color, you can see the color of the ground is changing in the sky model. Let's set the color to its default value. Now we can stop the rendering and go back to our camera and unhide the ground. And finally we can change the placement of the sun probably and render out different looks, but before that let's unhide the cloners so we get our grass fields and our flowers back. At the timing, unfortunately, Corona doesn't support the multi-instance feature in Cinema 4D R20 cloner object, and which is really essential, but you can simply just get realistic renders. I have used Corona proxies for these grasses and use the render instances option in the Cinema 4D cloner to basically be able to render this huge amount of geometry in the scene on a fairly modest machine. But you can check out the cloner options and the way I've created the proxies. We will be taking a look at the Corona proxy later on in the course, which is very simple. But you can see we're going to get a very nice render. I'm going to change the angle for our final render to around 13 degrees, and rotation can remain at around 320 degrees. As we are dealing with a fairly complex exterior scene, let's make sure the secondary GI solver is set to path tracing. even if you are actually using the UHD cache for your secondary solver, because you have this kind of very small kind of grass blades all over the place, the Corona engine will automatically use path tracing for those specific parts, because using UHD cache won't be efficient at all. But let's just make it easier for the render engine and use path tracing as our secondary GI engine. Now let's start the final render and make sure the exposure is set to -4 and highlight compression to probably 2.5 or 2, and let's wait for 3 minutes to see what we get for the actual final render. I'm gonna actually increase the resolution and have the noising on, but let's wait and see what we get in this smaller render. So here is our render. Let's increase the contrast to around 2 and saturation to around 0.12 and increase the filmic shadows to around 0.3, and you can see it's really nice and amazing. Now for the final render, I just increased the resolution to 1600 by 900, set the pass limit to 16 passes, and set the denoising mode to high quality. And when the render was done, I simply saved the CXR version to my disk, and now you can open up the CXR file using something like the Corona Image Editor, which is basically an external version of Corona Frame Buffer, which allows you to edit your renders after the render is done and you have saved it out using the CXR file. So let's, I've already saved out, as I mentioned, the final render as a CXR file, so you can open it up in the Corona Image Editor. You can even, I'm gonna just open, you can see this is the CXR file, and as you can see, it's been associated with the Corona Image Editor. So let's open it up. In the Corona Image Editor, we can probably even turn on the bloom and glare post effect. And you can see this is without bloom and glare, and this is with bloom and glare turned on. Let's just set the bloom intensity at around 0.1 and glare at around 0.02. And now we get some nice bloom and glare. And obviously we can turn it off as we want. And here are the kind of final renders with bloom and glare and without bloom and glare. Okay, you can play around with the Corona Sun and Sky and use probably the Rawa fake model and create some imaginary sky and change the sun position in the Hosek and Wilkie model and get different renders from the scene. In this lesson, we learn about Corona Sun and Sky. See you in the next lesson.